I thought they were going to cancel the thing. It was just taking so much time.
And director Richard Fleischer soon ran into yet another unforeseen problem.
When we first started working in the water, I thought that's the end of the picture, because what we hadn't counted on was the silt that's on the bottom of the ocean. And if you walk through that or even swim above it with flippers, it stirs up this great clouds of silt and makes it impenetrable. It just looks like thick, heavy fog, and you don't see anything. I thought this is where I get fired, because here we've got these tons of equipment and an enormous amount of money that we've spent, and I can't shoot it. I didn't really know what to do. And finally, the head of our safety department, Fred Zendar, came up with a solution that worked.
Anywhere that we had a shot, they would put down huge hemp carpets.
And the actors can walk on that with stirring up the bottom, up to a point. You can't do it too long, but you can get a couple of takes out of that. And we tried it, and it worked. Of course, it was a tremendous load off of my mind. I really was terribly worried about that.
The burial scene alone took 8 tedious days to complete. It required 33 men to be underwater simultaneously, 11 in front of the camera and 22 behind.
It was the largest number of people to be underwater simultaneously, I think, that had ever been attempted up to this time.
There was a stretcher that 4 of us carried that had the dead crew member on. I was the one on the left, on the back on the stretcher. And the crew member was made out of heavy chicken wire, and it was a beautiful job. It just looked like a person, and on that they put a asbestos blanket, which was fairly heavy, so that it didn't blow off when we were walking. There were 1 or 2 behind us, so we walked to this site that had 2 rows of coral, and Captain Nemo got in the front of the coral. He put his cross down, and then when he put his hands down, we were supposed to turn around to the side and pick up the coral and gently place it on the body. But the only problem was there wasn't enough room to turn around. Well, time was going by and everybody was getting panicked, and what we were doing is picking up the coral and throwing it on them. It was like a stoning. We smashed that poor guy down to nothing. It was just a flat sheet now. Nobody was smiling when we got up on the ship, but nobody said anything.
Most of the crew were unfazed by the dangerous experimental nature of filming underwater.
I can't think of any dangers, actually, other than once when a moray eel came out of his cave and after fish.
I was swimming around looking, and somebody tapped me on the shoulder. It was one of the other divers, and he said, "Look over there," and there's this moray eel about 3 feet from me. And, you know, it was an amazing adventure for me.
There were quite a few sharks, but they were small sharks, 5 feet long, something like that.
We had a drill for emergencies so that every safety man that was down there knew what to do.
There was a doctor on board who constantly monitored the health of the divers. But even with all these precautions, there was one emergency.
One of the divers tore his suit.
In a 1998 telephone interview, diver Al Hansen, who doubled for actor Kirk Douglas, recalled what happened.
We were doing the shark fight. Navy Commander Hooper was running his Navy camera called an Eclair, I believe. He was running the camera because he had the big swim fins. Disney cameraman asked him if he would run that shot with a Navy camera. It was supposed to be the shark's point of view. And he came down, he was looking through the eyepiece, and he couldn't judge the depth of the distance through the eyepiece of the camera. And I saw him, he could overshoot. In fact, I even laid at the bottom trying to get out of the way, but he took a chunk out of my shoulder, took a chunk out of the Belacqua suit. Had enough safety men around that they would all They got me back to the barge, of course.
The divers came in and grabbed him and lifted him up to the surface, and another guy was up there to unscrew his helmet so that he could start breathing air.
I remember one day we were out there. We were coming back in because a storm came up, a bad storm. And I noticed that the ship captain was doing circles. So, always being curious, I went over to the side of the ship, and here was a native boy. He had a little dugout, which was only about 7 feet long, and it is swamped, and he was just barely floating. So the captain came around, and he came along this kid, and I was on the side of the ship, and I got a hold of a steel pipe, and I leaned over, and as this kid went by, I reached down, and he reached up, and I got his wrist on a wave. When I pulled him up, stuck him on deck. And I wish I'd have got pictures of that.
Due to the dangerous nature of shooting underwater, the 4 leading stars were not required to dive in front of the cameras.
Walt suggested that we would shoot some of the scenes that we needed to carry the story and do it dry for wet. And this was kind of risky because the Bahamas, the ocean there, it had a kind of a milky appearance that I had to reproduce on stage. And I did it by blowing a kind of dust and spraying the stage and then shooting quickly before the thing all fell. I think the lucky part was that the color matched. When you do a real wet scene, it has to look like the same scene.
In addition to the dry for wet sequences, 20,000 Leagues used many other special effect techniques.
When they got down in the submarine and opened up the big window, we shot some of those scenes 2 different ways, but most of it was rear projection.
Was a system that was utilized in 20,000 Leagues and a lot of the films that were created during the 50s and 60s for Disney. And rear projection was basically a screen that the camera projected a pre-photographed image. What the crew would do was go and photograph a specific scene, and they would shoot that on a separate day, and that would become the background element. And then what they would do is they would then project that image onto a screen on the set, and the actors would be in front of it, and they would be acting out their scene.
So as far as the camera taking the picture of them looking through the screen, they were really looking at a movie of just what they were looking at.
Since Disney was first and foremost an animation studio, it was only natural for the art form to find its way into the picture.
To realize a scene that would be impossible to get any other way.
It's when the sub has sunk to the lowest point that it's ever been, lower than anybody's ever gone before. And I had just read a big article in Life magazine about the weird kind of fish you see down at the bottom at great depths.
The fish and the denizens of this place seem to have their own light, their own illumination.
Aerials with light bulbs kind of things on the end and flashing lights. And I felt that we should see that through the window. And Walt didn't really agree with me. But he ordered the sequence made.
The chief effects animator here at the studio was Josh Medder. And Josh spent probably 6 months animating fish. And they ended up being able to use the fish they shot when they went on location down to the Bahamas. They didn't use any of Josh's fish. And they sat in the studio film library, which had cost a fortune to animate.
I devised a scheme of some sliding cells that made these move very realistically and approximated what actually could take place. Some of it was used and some of it was cut out.
Such as this rare, never-before-seen sequence of the Nautilus rising from the ocean depths. But not all of the animation created for the film was scrapped.